that we have a well-recognized expert here with us today to share her wisdom. And Jennifer Lawless is Associate Professor of Government at the American University in Washington, D.C., and also the Director of the Women and Politics Institute. She has also spent a number of years as an Assistant and Associate Professor at Brown University. Jennifer is a prolific writer and has written many articles and co-written a book with Richard Fox, It Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office. It would take me all day, and you don't have all day, to list all of her publications and speeches in her, I think, 16 or 17-page CV. So suffice it to say that she has focused in many articles and speeches is related to public office and women in public office. She has provided scholarly and political commentary and analysis to many media, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Christian Science Monitor, and I'm assuming on the internet, the CNN.com, MSNB.com, Fox News, and on and on. Notably, she is also the editor of Politics and Gender and has received many research and teaching awards. It is hard to do justice to her great career in a few words, but I'm sure that you'd rather hear Jennifer speak than me go on all day about her CV. So Jennifer, it's great to have you here today to share your experience and knowledge with us. We hope to have you back in a few years with your new book, which will be entitled, It Took a Candidate, Why Women Are Running for and Winning Office in Record Numbers. Jennifer Lawless.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to speak to you today about the research, about why women don't run for office, and in relaying some of the key findings of my research, I also want to tell you a little bit about my own experiences running for office. I ran for Congress in 2006 in the Democratic primary in Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District. And so hopefully over the course of the next 25 minutes or so, you'll gain a little bit more of an understanding regarding the impediments that women face when they run for office and what we can do to break down some of those barriers. So I think the best place to begin is by telling you about 4 of the men and women that I surveyed and researched for my book. I should note also that, title kidding aside, the first book came out in 2005. It was called It Takes a Candidate. We then resurveyed these people, and in 2010 produced It Still Takes a Candidate. And in a few years, hopefully it will be It Took a Candidate, but I have a feeling that it's going to be It Really, Really, Really Takes a Candidate. So we'll see. So let me tell you about these 4 people. Cheryl Perry made partner at a prestigious law firm in Hartford, Connecticut when she was only 33 years old. She was active with the Connecticut Trial Lawyers Association and the American Bar Association. She was very politically active in her community as well. She regularly attended school board and city council meetings. She considered herself a news junkie. She consulted numerous news sources every day. I asked her if she had ever considered running for office, and she laughed and said, "No, of course not." And I asked her why she had never considered running for office, and she said, "I'm not qualified. I couldn't run." Tricia Martinez also looked like an excellent candidate to me. She was a sociology professor at a large university in the Midwest, and her areas of expertise were juvenile justice and diversity. So she regularly found her expertise sought out by members of the state legislature. And in fact, she would testify regularly at committee hearings about these issues. In addition to her proximity to the political arena, she too considered herself very politically interested and very politically active. So I asked her if she had ever considered running for office. And she also laughed and said no. And I asked her why, and she said, "I could never do that. I'm not qualified." Then I interviewed Randall White. He was a biblical studies professor at a small liberal arts college on the East Coast. And I asked him the same questions. And when I asked him if he had ever considered running for office, he said, of course he had. And so I said, well, what level of office do you think you'd be most suited to run for? And he looked at me and said he could do them all. He attends every school board meeting, every city council meeting, and not only does he attend, he also always makes sure that he asks a question. So I said, why do you always ask a question? And he said, how will everyone know that I'm there? I have to stand up so that one day these people remember to vote for me. And finally, I spoke with Kevin Kendall. He was a litigator who lived outside of Seattle, Washington. And like the others, he was very active in his community. He served on the board of several nonprofit organizations. And he, too, consulted several news sources every day. I asked him if he had ever considered running for office. And he said he hadn't given it much thought, but sure, that sounds like something he might be interested in. Having now given it thought for 12 seconds, I asked him what level of office he thought he might be most suited to seek. And he said that when he was growing up, his mom told him he could be anything he wanted when he grew up, so he could do them all. Now, I'm a political scientist. I know that we cannot generalize from 4 people to discuss the way the world works. But the 4 stories that I just told you were indicative of the stories that emerged from 4,000 women and men that I surveyed and interviewed. We found that 50% of the people in this pool of eligible candidates, these were lawyers, business leaders, educators, and political activists, which are the 4 professions that are most likely to lead to political careers. 50% of these people had in fact considered running for office. But women were a third less likely than men to fall into that category of considering it. Women were also 50% less likely than men to do the typical things that you need to do before you run for office, like speak to your family members and friends, or think about raising money, or investigate how to place your name on the ballot. Of the people who had considered running for office, women were then 1/3 less likely than men actually to run. The good news is that on Election Day, about 400 people had run for office, and women and men were equally likely to win. And this is a pattern that we see across the country. When women run for office, they fare as well as their male counterparts, both in terms of vote totals and fundraising receipts. But because of this winnowing process, because women were less likely to think about it, and then less likely actually to do it, even though we started out with an equal number of women and men in this pool of eligible candidates, we wound up with twice as many men than women holding elected positions after Election Day. And that's what the book really begins to investigate. Why is it that women don't run for office? Why do men like Randall White and Kevin Kendall think they're well situated to run, whereas women like Cheryl Perry and Tricia Martinez never have even given it a thought? And what I'd like to do now is just highlight the 3 basic reasons. But before I do that, I also want to give you a few statistics. Over time, people assumed that as women acquired more credentials, as women became lawyers and business leaders, as incumbents retired, we would see major progress in terms of the number of women running for and winning elected office. The fact that there was no bias against women candidates made the prognosis seem bright. But currently, 83% of the members of the United States Senate, 84% of the members of the U.S. House of Representatives, 88% of state governors, 93% of big city mayors, 75% of statewide elected officials, and 76% of state legislators in the United States are men. Moreover, 89 nations surpass the United States in terms of the percentage of women in the national legislature. And whereas the 1990s and early 2000s saw incremental increases in the percentages of women running for and winning elective office, the 2010 elections represented a major setback. It was the first time in 30 years that we saw a net decrease in terms of the number of women in Congress. So why women are not running is a key barrier that needs to be addressed, because it's not only the social and institutional structures that are precluding them from emerging as candidates. Okay, so why don't women run for office? The first reason is not at all surprising. It has to do with family roles and responsibilities. Women in this pool of eligible candidates were 20% less likely than men to be married and to have children in the first place, which suggests that in order to achieve the highest levels of professional success, a lot of women have to forego traditional family arrangements. They might not think about it, it might not be a conscious decision, but in the general population, we don't see this discrepancy or this disparity. Of the other 80%, though, women are much more likely than their male counterparts to engage in traditional family arrangements. So, women, for example, who exist in the top tier of professional accomplishment are 10 times more likely than their male counterparts to be responsible for the majority of the household tasks, and 12 times more likely to be responsible for the majority of the child care. A lot of women, therefore, don't even think about running for office because it would be a pretty unappealing third job. They already have two. For a lot of men, it would be an interesting extracurricular activity. Now, it's also important to note that a lot of the women who did consider running for office didn't even consider it seriously because of these household roles. I interviewed a woman who was a political activist from Los Angeles, and I asked her if she had ever considered running for office. And she said, no, not with any serious thought. And I asked her why. And she said, I come home from work and I have to take care of whining, sniffling children and make them dinner and put them to bed. And then I have to take care of a whining, sniffling husband and cook him dinner and put him to bed. When am I going to run a campaign for the state Senate? And I think that really taps into this broader problem. Women have made major progress in terms of achievements on the work front and in terms of their professional success. But we have not seen any kind of concomitant shift on the home front. The household distribution of labor remains far from egalitarian, and as a result, politics becomes more difficult for women to navigate. Now, the good news is that women are more likely to say that they might be interested in running for office later in life, when their child care duties abate, for example. But we have career ladder politics, which means that most people start at the local level and then they might climb to the state legislative level and then maybe they'll run for federal office. So if women are systematically delaying their entry into the electoral arena by 18 years, that leaves them with three pretty unattractive options regarding this career ladder. They're either going to have to climb it faster, or they're not going to get as high, or they're going to have to start on a higher rung. And that's not to say they can't do it. Many women succeed. But it does suggest that navigating the candidate emergence process is more complex for women than men. Also, if this news is not bad enough for you, I want to note that women under the age of 35 succumb to the same kinds of patterns. It's a little bit better. They're only about 9 times more likely to be responsible for the household tasks and child care. So we've come a long way. But the fact is 9 times still makes it pretty difficult to balance a career, a family, and politics. I can tell you firsthand that part of the reason I was able to run for Congress, even though I had a full-time job, is because I was single with no children. Also, given an audience like this, I have to tell you, I would like not to be single, and I would like to have children. So if anybody knows anybody, this would be, you laugh, I'm so not kidding. The clock is ticking. But I should note that women under the age of 35 don't have to navigate these roles the same way, but the ones who do still find themselves engaged in this household division of labor. And so because I had no children and because I had no spouse, I was able to work full-time as a professor, and I was then able to work full-time as a candidate. And the only reason that I was able to do that was because when I came home at night, I didn't have to worry about anybody else. I didn't have to worry about whether anybody had eaten or about whether anybody had slept or about if anybody had a good day at work or at school. And that makes having 2 full-time jobs a little bit easier to swallow. The second barrier has to do with political qualifications. If I were to show you the CVs and the credentials of the 4,000 women and men that I surveyed and interviewed, you would be able to identify no differences between the women and the men. The overwhelming majority had public speaking experience, public policy expertise, they had fundraising experience, they had organized large events, they were politically connected. Yet 60% of the men, compared to fewer than 40% of the women, considered themselves qualified to run for office. Moreover, women were twice as likely as men to self-assess as not at all qualified to run for office. Now, that's an important fact, but it gets worse because women who don't think they're qualified to run for office don't think about running for office. Men who check off the box that says, I am not at all qualified to run for office, still have about a 50% chance of giving it serious thought. Now, this isn't surprising if you look at some of our elected officials, but it is a problem for gender equity. Now, the reason that this is also a problem is because it's not just about the objective credentials. So on a series of specific factors regarding public policy expertise, public speaking experience, fundraising experience, on each of those factors, women were less likely than men to say that they were good at that or that they possessed the skill. But women were also almost twice as likely as men to say that they lacked thick enough skin to run for office. They were significantly more likely to perceive bias in the electoral arena, And they were more likely than men, even though they lived in the exact same places, to perceive competitive local and congressional campaign environments. And so in a lot of ways, women thinking that they're not qualified may be a rational response to what they perceive as a biased electoral arena in which women need to be twice as good to get half as far. The reality of a somewhat level playing field where women can succeed on Election Day is only as good as the dissemination of that message. If women don't perceive an unbiased electoral arena, then it's a rational response not to enter it. And here I can give you a few more specific examples from my own experience. When I announced that I was running for Congress, I believed that I was qualified. About 10 minutes into the campaign, I started to doubt those qualifications. And in part, this has to do with the way voters react. As long as women are an anomaly in politics, they stand out. And when you stand out and you don't look like the cookie cutter insert female candidate here, you get quite a bit of commentary. So when I announced that I was running, I was 30 years old, and my hair was about this long. I went to an event, and I was speaking to a couple, and they told me that they thought I was great, they agreed with me on all of the issues, they wished me a lot of luck, and they would not be voting for me. And so I said, what do you mean you're not going to vote for me? And they said, well, when we look at you, we want to hire you as a babysitter. We don't want to send you to Washington. At that same event, I was told I was too short to be in Congress. But these were fixable things. I cut my hair 7 or 8 inches. I wore 4-inch heels everywhere I went. I didn't leave the house not wearing a dark suit, and I started wearing a lot of makeup. And someone early on said, well, don't you feel like, by the way, after I lost the election, I let my hair grow, and now it's just long out of protest. But after the election, somebody said to me, well, don't you feel you sold out? And my feeling was, as far as appearance is concerned, I'd rather look the part, because if you have 45 seconds with a voter, you want to talk about why you're running for office. You want to talk about universal health care, or the war in Iraq, or a woman's right to choose, all of the reasons I got into the race. I don't want to talk about whether my neckline is too low or my heels are too high. Now, there were certain things that, so I looked like, I had political helmet head, and I started looking like every other candidate looked. But the commentary never really stopped. I was having lunch with a donor one day who had promised me the world, and she never delivered. And finally, we had raised about $200,000 at this point. She finally wrote a phone number down on a napkin and handed it to me, and I thought, this is great. Finally, she's going to give me the name of somebody who could make a major campaign contribution. But when she handed me the napkin, she said, highlights. Call and get highlights. You'll look so much better. My favorite story, though, happened 3 days before the election. We were on TV all the time at this point. We had raised $400,000. There was no more media time that we could buy, so all of my time was spent meeting voters. So the last 72 hours of the campaign, I basically lived at grocery stores. So I'm standing in front of this grocery store, and this woman is in the parking lot, and she starts approaching me, and she recognizes me, and she's so excited. So she runs up to me, and she hugs me, and she whispers, don't worry. And I thought, this is so nice. She's going to say, don't worry, you're going to win the election, or don't worry, you ran a great campaign. She said, don't worry, you don't look nearly as fat in real life as you do on TV. So I said, thank you, because really, what do you say, who raised you? And at that point, though, I realized that that's the problem, that women don't think they'll have thick enough skin to weather that kind of commentary. And frankly, if you would have told me 16 months before the campaign that anybody would have said that to me, I would have probably cried at the thought of hearing it. But the nice thing is that when you run for office, it takes about 10 minutes to develop the thick skin that you need. And so I think women doubting their qualifications in part reflects this notion that they're going to be judged more harshly on the campaign trail. And what they don't realize is that it does not take a lot to develop the skills that you need to withstand that kind of criticism. That's not to say that it's fair, but it is to say that it's also rare. These are amusing stories, which is why I told them, but they're also the worst that happened. I didn't tell you about the 99% of the interactions with people that were incredibly compelling and powerful, and I didn't tell you about everything that I learned from voters along the way, and how it not only made me, I think, a nicer person, but somebody who would have been far more able to legislate effectively on behalf of other people. But the qualifications piece is certainly relevant because we tend to think of ourselves as we are now and not the people we would become once we ran for office. And then the third barrier has to do with political recruitment. Women are significantly less likely than men to receive the suggestion to run for office from anyone. They're less likely to receive the suggestion from a party leader, elected official, or political activist, and they're less likely to receive the suggestion to run from a family member, colleague, or friend. The good news is, when women receive the suggestion to run for office, and they realize that they've received the suggestion to run for office, they're just as likely as men to respond positively to that recruitment. The bad news is that, at least anecdotally, women might need to hear the message a little bit more often. And so let me just give you two quick examples. I interviewed a woman when I was writing the book and asked her if she had ever considered running and if she had ever been recruited to run. And she told me no. She answered no to both of those questions. About 20 minutes into the interview, though, she was telling me about a meeting she had recently had with the mayor of her town. She was very interested in education reform, and she had a meeting with the mayor because she felt that it was important for the school board, the city council, and the mayor's office to all be on the same page, or else this reform was never going to be enacted. And so the mayor met with her for quite some time and ultimately said, look, the problem is that the school board is not on board. There's going to be an open seat, though. You should run for that seat. I'll help you do it because you could actually tilt support for this policy on the school board. So I said to her, that's great, but you said that you had never considered running for office and that nobody had ever recruited you to run. And she said, well, the mayor wasn't serious. The very same day, this is like a political scientist's dream come true, the very same day I interviewed a man and asked him the same questions. And so he said, oh yeah, I'm really glad you asked me that. I was recruited to run for office last week. So I said, great, tell me what happened. So he was flying cross country and he had a layover at O'Hare Airport in Chicago and his flight was delayed. So he went to the airport bar and ordered a drink, and CNN was on in the background. So apparently he started providing political commentary along with the pundits on CNN. And when his flight was called and he got up to leave, the bartender said to him, you know a lot, you should run for office. And he's considering this a formal recruitment attempt, right? Now, hopefully these are the two ends of the continuum, and it's not that women are being offered keys to the city all over the world and they're not realizing it, and men are not running for governor because the bartender thinks they'd be good at it. But it does at least provide some anecdotal evidence of the fact that just because a woman is recruited does not necessarily mean that she perceives seriously being recruited, and that interacts with the whole self-doubt regarding the qualifications. The good news is that's something that we can easily fix. The powerful effect of a friend or a colleague recruiting a woman is the same size as that of a party leader or elected official. So if we see a woman who we think would make an excellent candidate, all we need to do is tell her, maybe 17 times, that she should consider running for office. And if we recruit early and we recruit often, we actually can see major gains. We know, for example, that men and women who run for office as students in both high school or college are substantially more likely to consider running for office later in life. And so if we can get to younger women early and then sustain those recruitment efforts over time, we really can make a difference. So at the end of the day, why is all of this important? I'd argue that it matters for three reasons, and these reasons are not going to come as a surprise because you're sitting in this room for this very purpose. But the first is simple democratic legitimacy. Something seems fundamentally wrong with a political system where women are 52% of the population and fewer than 20% of the elected officials. In the United States, we have no problem working with other countries to suggest 25% gender quotas when they're making new constitutions or when they're trying to rebuild their governments. But that's a standard to which we've never held ourselves. So we clearly recognize it's important, we just don't think it matters to us. The second reason has to do with collaboration, cooperation, and leadership style. The greater the percentage of women involved in any kind of debate or deliberation, the more likely that you wind up with more debate, more deliberation, and more unanimous outcomes. If a committee issues a unanimous decision, that often affects the way that bill or that piece of legislation is treated on the floor. And third, women are more likely than their male counterparts of the same party to prioritize issues dealing with women, families, and children. This is not to say that gender trumps party. It doesn't. Party is the best predictor of how somebody will vote, of how somebody's policy preferences line up. But within the parties, women are more likely than men to be champions of issues that predominantly affect women, children, and families. And so if we want to represent the issues and the interests of large chunks of the population, then increasing the number of women in politics is one sure way to do it. And so as I end my remarks today, I just want to encourage everybody sitting in this room to at least think about running for office. I think that if we knew that women were thinking about it and just choosing not to do it, we would be in a very different place than we are right now. The fact that women are a third less likely than men even to have the notion of a candidacy occur to them represents what I think is a pretty big crisis. They're not deciding not to do it because they think politics are unattractive. They're deciding not to do it because they don't even realize it's an option. And if I told you that women were a third less likely to think about becoming lawyers or doctors or teachers, we would say that that was fundamentally problematic in our society. But because of the way politics is often regarded, we tend not to think that way. But it's through politics that laws are written, that legislation is enacted, and that women's futures are secured. So I encourage everybody to think about running for office and certainly to recruit everybody that they think would be an excellent candidate to throw their hats into the ring. Thank you very much. And we have time for, I think, about 2 questions. If anybody has a question. Nobody has a question? Yes.
I want to know if the women willing to run had anything to do with a male or woman encouraging them to run, or if the stature of the person in society also influenced how serious they considered that.
Those are great questions. In terms of recruitment, the overwhelming majority of electoral gatekeepers, party leaders, elected officials, etc., are still men. And so the majority of the men and women who were recruited to run for office were recruited by men. And those messages resonated the same way as recruitment by a woman. So that's good news because it means that we can start increasing the number of women who are recruited before we have a large increase in the number of women in office. So we don't necessarily have a chicken and egg problem. In terms of stature, lawyers and political activists were most likely to consider running for office, and that was the case for both women and men. Business leaders and educators were less likely, but the gender gap within each of the professions was roughly the same size. So it didn't matter whether you were in the highest prestige profession or not, you were still less likely to think about running for office if you were a woman.
Sorry, just to clarify that, I wanted to know if say, another politician encouraged a candidate, or if
it didn't matter.
Okay.
So the effect of your colleague at your high school encouraging you to run was just as powerful as another politician. But keep in mind that I'm predicting whether somebody has ever actually considered it. When you talk about deciding to enter a specific race at a specific time, the role of electoral gatekeepers, politicians, and party leaders become more important. But to get it on your radar screen, it doesn't matter who the source is.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your comments. It was just wonderful to sit here and laugh with you because so many of those stories are very familiar to me. I'm Janice Kinch. I'm speaking with my Equal Voice hat on. I'm from Equal Voice, Alberta South, in the western part of Canada. And I'm paying testimony to your comments about women having to be asked more times. Don't wait too long. I've waited a long time because I've been told I should run, I should run, I should run. I was finally asked before Christmas, and I am running.
Great.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm Heather Jane Robertson. I'm part of Equal Voice. I was wondering about, repeat offenders or recidivism rates, depending on how you look at it, for women who have run and not been successful, men who have run and not been successful. Does your research point to a gap between those who give it another try? It seems to me that in biographies of successful politicians, both male and female, tend to involve several unsuccessful attempts at the beginning. I ran once, and I must say, a couple of people said inquisitively rather than persuasively, "So are you going to run again?" But there wasn't sort of a sustained recruitment like there was the first time to get me to do it the first time. So I'm just wondering if there's a gender gap there.
As far as I know, and as far as other researchers have found, there is not. So the majority of men who run for office the first time lose. The majority of women who run for office first time lose. And most candidates who win have previously run. That said, there are far, far more examples of men giving it another shot than women giving it another shot, because there are far, far more male candidates than female candidates. And so I think what tends to happen is we can come up with a few examples of women who choose not to run again, and we assume that that's sort of what happens, and we see all of these men who lose and they run again. But fortunately, I think that's just a series of high-profile examples. The same can be said for the high-profile women in politics right now. A lot of people are shocked when they hear about the statistics, because on the front page of the newspaper, we often see Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi or Sarah Palin. But those famous faces really obscure the grave underrepresentation of women.
Hi, I'm Maria Fitzpatrick. I'm the Regional Executive Vice President for the Public Service Alliance of Canada, responsible for the National Capital Region. And I guess I'm going to give testimony to what you said about the thick skin. It took me more than 10 minutes. It's been 3 years, and it's way thicker than any of my male counterparts. They certainly don't take the same kind of abuse or put up with the abuse that I've had to put up with. But I certainly think that my own life experience has made a difference in terms of being able to weather the storms that I've weathered over the last 3 years. We heard a young Aboriginal sister speak yesterday who's really been involved in politics since she was 14. She just didn't realize she was involved in politics, and I certainly hope that she's going to follow through and run. And I hope that you're going to run again, and I'll have a donation for you if you're ready to run again. So thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and to affirm the feelings that I've had.
Thank you very much. Okay. I've been told this is the last question.
Yes.
Oh, I can keep going. Okay.
Good morning. My name is Denise Ciele, and we have a webcast question from Karen. And the question is, while a lot of women don't run for office, many of them are engaging in political issues through NGOs. Do you think this is where our potential candidates are going instead of running for office? And do you think this is an equally effective way to engage and influence political issues?
So this is an excellent question, because we asked the men and women that we surveyed and interviewed to rank order a series of ways to get involved in the political process, from working behind the scenes, working at nonprofits, and working on other people's campaigns, giving money, or running for office. And the least attractive option for both women and men was running for office. 90% of women and 90% of men would rather do anything else, include getting a root canal. Literally, that was a quote from one of the respondents. So men and women are equally likely to be turned off by politics. But for some reason, men are more likely to, for lack of a better phrase, suck it up and do it anyway. And so that's not to say because it's more effective. It's just, I think, because they realize that that is a way to be very visible and have quite a bit of power. So I certainly would never want to discourage women who are very interested in policy from working through NGOs or working behind the scenes or engaging in other types of political activism. But I would remind everybody that at the end of the day, it's the elected officials who are the ones who are casting the votes. It's the elected officials who are the ones who are writing the policies. And they can be influenced by other groups, but ultimately it's their call. And so if we want to ensure that women's full voice is at the table, then I don't think that we can do it exclusively in an indirect way. We can take more questions.
Hi, my name is Kyler Nolmfitch. I'm from Humboldt, Saskatchewan. My question is, you had said that the background of most candidates, they tend to be lawyers, teachers, doctors, whatever. Did you ever find that people question your legitimacy because you are educated in political science?
No, so educators are the third leading profession. And in fact, I think people assumed that I was qualified to run for office because I studied political science, because most people don't realize that political scientists know nothing about politics. And so unless you're a political scientist, I think that you confer more credibility to us. I can't tell you how many of my colleagues don't read the newspaper. It is not a happy day in the political science department at most universities across the country. But ironically, I think that that gave me, I was perceived as having public policy expertise that I may not have had. For me, the biggest challenge, I think, was that I was relatively new to Rhode Island and I was young. And so any doubts about my qualifications, and really in retrospect, I think they were more self-imposed, and I was assuming that people doubted my qualifications even when they did not. But those doubts, I don't think, nobody ever questioned my educational pedigree or my background on that front. The one other thing that I want to mention that's somewhat linked to this that I did not mention in my remarks is people tend to think, oh, women don't want to get involved because everything that they've done or all of their credentials or all of their qualifications will be dragged up and out through a negative campaign. And I can tell you that a negative campaign is about 65% of women say that they wouldn't be interested in running for office because they have no interest in engaging in that. But I can tell you firsthand that the day the negative campaign starts is the day you're a legitimate candidate. And I never would have thought that this was the case, but we had been running, my campaign lasted about 16 months, and it wasn't until about 4 or 5 months before the election that my opponent started to realize that maybe I posed a threat. And so everything I had ever done or said, any quote that I had ever made to a newspaper about anything was sort of brought up again as public fodder and commentary. And I was fine with that, and I was surprised that I was fine with it, but it didn't matter because it demonstrated that he was worried. And then one of the best days on the entire campaign, I'll never forget this, I was making fundraising phone calls about 30 hours a week, so I was always in the basement of our campaign office on the phone, and we had a TV on, and CNN was on in the background, and all of a sudden I look up, and on the screen is like this distorted version of my face, and my opponent comes on and says, "Jennifer Lawless distorts the truth." And then he says that while she's, slinging mud and telling lies, I'm saving the world, and flags start waving and babies start smiling and patriotic music starts playing. And I remember running up the stairs to tell my campaign manager that this ad was on, and I was so thrilled. I mean, I was a little mortified that a million Rhode Islanders now thought I was a liar, but I was just so excited that he had spent several $100,000 questioning me and my integrity, because you don't spend that kind of money if you're not worried. And so, ironically, what happens is anything that you might doubt or anything that you've said or any trash that they might be able to rifle through, ironically becomes appealing in a lot of ways, because if they're willing to spend the time doing that, then it means that it's a tough race. Also, the overwhelming majority in the United States, we have 520,000 elective offices, and the overwhelming majority are at the local level, where you would be lucky to get any coverage of this race. So a lot of the time, people think about the media going through your trash or running negative ads, but in most cases, there's no media attention whatsoever. So I think what happens is women tend to think, oh, well, I don't know if I could run the way Hillary Clinton did. You don't have to. No one is paying attention. And so it's important, I think, to just lower the bar a little bit. And we don't need to be ready to run for president if we really just are seeking a position as dog catcher, which is elected in many, many cities. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jonathan. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm particularly fascinated by the distinction you make in your research between candidates or women and men considering to run and then the decision to actually run, and the idea of electoral gatekeepers. Yesterday's panel, one of them talked about the importance of achieving critical mass. I'm wondering if, given that you're saying the electoral gatekeepers influence that final decision to actually run, if you see any systemic or institutional change that could incite them, maybe electoral incentives, to actually help achieve that critical mass given their role?
Okay. If that's okay. Oh, take this out. Okay. Okay.
Hi, I'm Sandra from McGill. I'm also doing my MA in political science right now. Well, you're a Ph.D. actually. My question is specifically relating to your experience running at such a young age in terms of trying to get support from the donors or people you had to talk with. Is there a role that young women can feel in terms of policy? I mean, since we lack all the experience that our older counterparts would have, what did you say to these donors and potential supporters in terms of, ways? What was it that you could tell them, since we generally lack more experience and, they undermine our potential to run because we don't have that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Let me answer the first question first. Regarding critical mass and electoral incentives, I think that there is no question that there are electoral incentives that could make everybody, men and women, more inclined to run for office. Public financing, for example, was something that 2/3 of the women and men said that they would be interested in. But it's unclear to me that that would actually close the gender gap in political ambition, because many more men would be interested in running as well. So I think recruitment is the biggest issue here. There's no evidence to suggest that gatekeepers are systematically excluding women. Part of it is that they're not thinking about recruiting women, but when that suggestion is made to them, they're receptive to it. And part of it is that they recruit from their own networks, and their own networks still remain male-dominated. And so letting party leaders know, letting political activists know, and letting elected officials know that it's important to encourage more women to run for office, I think is a relatively easy short-term step. And I think in telling these electoral gatekeepers that they need to recruit women, we need to highlight the fact that when women run, overall, they're just as successful as men, that when women run, they're just as able as men to raise money, and that when women run, voters, male and female, are willing to support them. And so there is no electoral risk involved in encouraging a woman to run for office. And if we get that out, I think that provides incentives to the gatekeepers, and then the gatekeepers can encourage the women to get involved, and we can then handle this, at least in the short term, on a relatively individual basis. Regarding the messages for young women, your question is interesting to me because in a lot of ways, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you just doubted your qualifications as well as every other woman under the age of 35. And I think this is the problem, right? What is to say that we're not qualified? Literally, have you looked at some of these male elected officials? I mean, a man wakes up in the morning and he's like, oh, I think I'll be president today. A woman wakes up and she's like, well, I'm not sure that I'm qualified to be an administrative assistant. Why? And so in a lot of ways, the good news is that women, especially young women, represent everything that is not common in politics. And during any kind of anti-establishment or anti-incumbency or anti-politics mood in the country, that gives us an advantage, because when people look at us, they think change. And there's no better way to embody change symbolically than by electing a young woman. And so I'm not going to lie to you. I was very I erred on the side of providing a ton of statistics. Anytime I ever met anybody, it didn't matter who they were, they would find out within Rhode Island's fourth graders read below grade level, that 75% performed below grade level in math, that 1 in 3 Rhode Islanders was housing insecure, that we received a D+ in terms of reproductive freedom. I mean, I would cite experts, I would cite statistics, but I was able to do that pretty quickly early on, so that nobody ever questioned whether I knew enough, and nobody ever questioned whether I was smart enough. And instead, really, I would say 95% of those conversations were about how can I win? Because people don't want to support somebody just because they think they're smart or just because they think they represent change. They want to know that that person knows how to win. And that's a strategy that has a lot less to do with experience and a lot more to do with just listening to people. And so I would highlight the fact that there was no electoral risk involved in voting for me, because there was no Republican running in the general election. So this seat was going to remain a Democratic seat. I would highlight the fact that Although Rhode Island was a heavily Democratic state and the district was a heavily Democratic district, the man against whom I was running had voted 27 times against a woman's right to choose, had voted 12 times to stay the course in Iraq, and had voted for the most egregious provisions of the Patriot Act. And people were shocked by that. And I would tell them that I was shocked by that and that we needed change. And I would tell them that he voted 60% of the time with Republicans. And so if you could provide the pieces of information and also explain that you can win this race because A, B, and C, that's what it takes. So if you have the confidence and if you have the conviction, as sad as it is, most people don't do that much delving into the substance of what you're saying. And so a lot of it is style. Know that you have the substance. Without the substance, you shouldn't be running in the first place. But don't assume that anybody is going to question that. They really just want to know that you're a formidable candidate, and by supporting you, they're not basically giving up a vote. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jennifer. I'd like to invite the Susan Crystal, who is the Minister Counselor for Public Affairs with the American Embassy, to come up and thank Jennifer.
Good morning. A bit of a hard act to follow. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say on behalf of the U.S. Embassy that we're really delighted to be in partnership with Carleton University and Equal Voice in helping support Jennifer's visit up to Canada. One of the things that our embassy here does and our missions around the world are really to look for ways to create that dialogue between peoples of different countries. And even though we're just nearby, there's lots of opportunities to support these types of exchanges and opportunities to really share ideas. And we're really delighted to have Jennifer here. Yesterday I got a bit of a preview because we did a brief digital video conference with our missions across the country in the various cities. And the minute it was over, I'd had a text from our office in Calgary saying, everything's a buzz in Calgary. Everyone loved what Jennifer had to say. There's so much interest in this whole issue. And certainly from the State Department's perspective, focusing on women and girls around the world is certainly something very important to our Secretary. Hillary Clinton has put a very big focus during her time as Secretary of State, and clearly the Obama administration in general, in looking for ways to support women and girls around the world. And part of that was the Secretary naming Meland Verveer, who comes from an organization somewhat similar to Equal Voice called Vital Voices, as our ambassador for global women's issues. And we're going to look for a way to get her up here one of these days as well, because I think there's really a lot of opportunities to share some of the things that her office has been doing around the world. Certainly from the United States perspective, we can really learn, as Jennifer pointed out, a lot of the good things that are going on in countries around the world. And just like to cite one additional thing that our Secretary was involved in this week for International Women's Week. She had started a couple of years ago, or the State Department had started a couple of years ago, an annual International Women of Courage Awards. And we identify usually 10 or 12 women around the world involved in a host of things. Many of them are very much involved in women's issues. They're involved in looking for ways to support women and girls. And this week she was joined by Julia Gillard, the newly elected Prime Minister of Australia, the first woman in that role. And they honored women from a big range of countries, from Costa Rica to Cuba to Belarus to, I think it was in Kyrgyzstan, the Kyrgyz Republic. And this was one of the first years, interestingly enough, that there were two women who were elected officials. One was the former president of Kyrgyzstan, the first woman of a Central Asian nation, and also an elected woman in parliament in Hungary who was from the Roma nationality, and along with women who were fighting, the good fight in a lot of areas. And so the Secretary had mentioned that was kind of an interesting mix of women. We get different people every year, but I think it ties in very closely to what a lot of women are trying to look to do to make a voice in the national discussion. And just one little anecdote. When I was thinking about what I was going to say here, I was reminded my 15-year-old daughter was doing a course on women's issues and in high school, and they were talking about the suffrage movement in the United States and Canada, various places. And she said to me, as she was thinking about it, she was thinking, oh, remember we used to always watch Mary Poppins and that scene where there are votes for women, and didn't the teacher then show that scene? And I was kind of proud of her. I said, sort of make that connection, and hopefully that will translate into votes for women, more votes for women, and maybe votes for Jennifer if she chooses to run again. With that, let me just thank you on behalf of everyone here for taking the time to come up, and best of luck, and we look forward to seeing you again.